Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the lecture video for our types of offenses. I've uploaded this uh, PowerPoint already, so you should be aware of what's in it. It does cover the last chapters of this book. Obviously, I did say that I would do an actual lecture video for it, so that's what this is. So, this is just covering all of the types of offenses. So, keep that in mind. So, there's a lot going on as if you've given it a look, so we'll just dive into it. So, incoherent offenses, as I mentioned last time in the last lecture from last week, I mentioned that incoherent crimes literally is just incomplete crimes. And this breaks down to, you know, a couple larger areas. So, attempt, conspiracy, and solicitation are all kind of under this incoherent offenses. And so, we're going to actually go through some of these. So we're going to talk about attempt first. And what attempt is the exact thing it sounds like. You are attempting to do something. And so, especially in particular, we have two types of attempt statutes, which is general and specific. And obviously, so some states vary. Some will have just general attempt, and some will have specific attempt. But hopefully, by this point, knowing what you know throughout this class, you'll know that what it means to be between general and specific. But in general, if there is a specific attempt statute, that means that there are certain laid out crimes or details that must be met to count as attempt, whereas general attempt statutes just kind of say if you attempted to commit some crime, that covers general attempt statute, and that would again cover a large proportion. So our textbook even says specific attempt statutes typically look for specific crimes like murder, robbery, or rape. So again, as I said, I hope that you were able to pick that up. But how they go about defining attempt comes down to there's four tests that are generally in mind when we talk about what attempt is. Because that's the other thing. How do you prove the act of attempting to commit a crime? Well, you're going to have to figure that out because attempt doesn't necessarily mean that you've completed it. And so that's why I said there are four tests to identify what type of attempt it is. So it's proximity test, res ipsa loquitur test, probable distance test, and substantial steps test. And the substantial steps test actually comes from Model Penal Code. That's actually designed by them. And so proximity test really is it's measuring how close the defendant is to completing the offense. So it looks at, okay, how much further before you actually commit the crime are you? That's proximity test. Res is wow. Res ipsa loquitur test literally just means the thing speaks for itself. That's what the Latin means. This is also sometimes called the unequivocality test. And the idea is that you look at all the facts of the case itself, and it should point out that there was a stopping point. So, really, it's looking at all the facts of the case so far and goes, okay, was there a logical stopping point or not? Was it convinced by an individual or not? That kind of thing. So, really, it comes down that they stopped it for no other purpose than committing the specific crime at issue. Probable distance test is kind of like the proximity test, where proximity test looked at how close to finishing. Probable distance test looks at how far you've come towards it. So it looks at how much time, how much effort did you spend putting into the crime rather than how close were you to committing the crime. So if it was a crime that takes, all of 3 seconds to complete, did you spend months and months planning it? That would be probable distance. Whereas if it's a crime like a bank robbery and it takes a while and you plan it, but you never actually commit through, you might see the proximity test as, you didn't quite get there. So it really does depend on how you want to define this. And so obviously substantial steps test, like I said, the model penal code developed this one in particular. The reason it was developed because jurisdictions, have different depending which ones they want to do. Do they follow the proximity test or the probable distance or res ipsa loquitur? Like the idea was that if the model penal code creates one, everyone can use it. And so for this one, the substantial steps test is intended to clarify and simplify the attempt act analysis. So all it's looking for is substantial steps. So significant movements towards committing a crime. This is where, when we talked about words can sometimes be, probable cause probable cause and things of that nature. Substantial steps goes, is it enough to just say it, or do you actually have to, say it, buy some equipment, start networking? Those would be substantial steps, not just, I want to do this. I say that and that's it. No, that's not what that means. Substantial steps is literally taking some serious steps and guides towards the next thing. And so underneath attempt, we also have to talk about preparatory crimes. This is just some states have statutes criminalizing behavior that are considered preparatory under the 4 tests that were already mentioned. So this is where preparatory crimes, having burglars' tools of the trade, things of that nature. You don't have to have a previous history of it. You don't have to actually commit a crime. But if you're holding, like I said, burglary tools, drug selling tools, things like that, if the particular jurisdiction has preparatory crime statutes, you can be charged on the same level as attempt, even if you had no intent to actually do it, you just owned it. So that's kind of the problem. And when we talk about attempt, one thing that we need to talk about in particular is the intent behind it. And so the intent behind attempts, and I know that's a lot of like similar sounding words, it's why I'm tripping up with it. But the intent or the intentions behind completing an attempt crime look for specific intent or purposely. Again, this kind of goes back to this preparatory crime idea. Just because you say it or just because you own something doesn't necessarily mean you plan on doing it. If they can prove that there is specific intent, then yes, that goes forward. And so obviously there are some defenses in defense of attempt. One is legal impossibility and the other one is voluntary abandonment. Voluntary abandonment is the easy one to understand. It's where the individual who is going to commit the crime decides on their own accord to stop committing the crime. That's it. They weren't coerced. It's not that, they committed the crime and they were going to get caught, so they stopped. No, they stop it before they commit the crime. They voluntarily abandoned their plan to commit a crime, and if they were charged with attempt, they could be, well, look, clearly they didn't complete it, and they chose to stop because they just no longer wish to complete it. That would be voluntary abandonment. Legal impossibility is a little different. And so legal impossibility is different from factual impossibility, which is not possible. Factual impossibility would be that, the truth as it is was not understood or clear. Legal impossibility means that the defendant believes what they are attempting to do is illegal when it is not. So if you're like, well, what does that mean? Let's just say the textbook example has a young couple who decides to poison and murder their neighbor's dog. And the one individual is 18, and they believe that where they live, it is illegal to buy poison if you are under the age of 18, when in fact they believe it's illegal if it's under the age of 21, but it is in fact under the age of 18, so they legally can. They could not be charged if they were charged with attempted murder of an animal because they bought poison. They can technically argue that the legal impossibility, they thought that by buying it they were already breaking a law, but hey, it actually wasn't. And so yeah, legal impossibility is a little bit weird and different. That's why I say voluntary abandonment, that's the one that people understand. It's the easier to figure out. So moving on, we need to talk about conspiracy. So what is conspiracy? And I legitimately just gave the most basic definition here as well. Conspiracy is an agreement to work together. And again, this kind of intent behind it, conspiracy as an offense, is there is a specific intent to complete some kind of illegal activity. So that's the big piece to go there. Oh, excuse me. Because the way conspiracy works, that it has to be more than one individual, accomplice liability comes up, and it's clear to understand how that works. But in particular, when we talk about conspiracy, it's not always just two people. It tends to be more. And so when we think about larger groups, there are two large-scale formats when we talk about organized conspiracy. These would be things like mafia, any kind of organized crime unit, gangs, things of that nature. So the two main scales is a wheel conspiracy and a chain conspiracy. And if you're trying to figure out what the heck each one of those means, literally visualize a wheel or visualize like a chain. So like a chain links, you know how, it's one after another, after another, after another, and after another. That's basically what that explanation is. So in a chain conspiracy, one person co-conspires with another person, who co-conspires with another person, co-conspires with another person. It's in a line. It continues. No one is, the ringleader and out to everyone. That's wheel conspiracy. Wheel conspiracy is where an individual is at the center. They're the one that conspires with all the other people. The other people might be co-conspirators together, but they are more than likely directly connected to the center point. And so then you have all the different spokes of a wheel that may play in together, may not, but they're all connected into this one larger group. And so that's really what large-scale formatting for conspiracy looks like. Obviously, we can just do one-on-one, that kind of thing. And typically, chain conspiracy is, where you have just a group of people that are working together. The traditional, the Joker's bank heist from The Dark Knight, if you remember that, is technically a wheel conspiracy because he was at the center. But if you look at the way each individual, they all had a job, that's the same kind of way that chain conspiracy does. This person is co-conspiring with that person. Their job is to do this. That person does that. That person does that, and that, and that. That's the basic understanding. But like I said, that actual example is really a wheel conspiracy, but it works to also explain how chain conspiracy works. So you notice I have something that says Pinkerton rule. And if you're not familiar with Pinkerton rule, so in some states and definitely at the federal level, people who enter into conspiracy are criminally responsible for every reasonably foreseeable crime committed in furtherance of the conspiracy. So this is what is the Pinkerton rule, and it came from a U.S. Supreme Court case, Pinkerton versus the U.S., 1946. And the whole purpose behind this was just because you were one cog in the overall wheel doesn't mean that you are not guilty of committing the overall crime. And so that's what this does, is Pinkerton rule makes sure that everyone is equally accountable for a major crime when committed, especially if there is conspiracy. So that's the whole point there. And then obviously that brings up renunciation as a defense. And what does that mean? Well, if you are familiar with Latin or anything else, you might see, redo again, but then again also nunciation. What is that all about? So renunciation means that you are actually just, it's kind of like voluntary abandonment, but you actually kind of work against the group. So, renunciation means that you renounce your previous conspiracy, your previous engagement with that group, and you're willing to help further the drive to stop the issue. So that is really the defense. If an individual decides real quickly, yeah, I don't want to be part of this group anymore, I think this is really bad, and you turn what we see in television all the time, state's evidence, this is renunciation. That if they did go to court, that would be the thing. And then, of course, if you're familiar with RICO, awesome. If not, let me be the one to tell you. In particular, there is an actual organization act, and that is the RICO Act, and that's Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act. And so RICO really, it provides extensive criminal penalties and a civil cause of action for organized crime, and it includes all offenses that are criminal under state or federal law. Its original intention clearly was to focus on sophisticated criminal business like loan sharking, the mafia, and high stakes gambling. Nowadays, it's much broader so that it can kind of cover white collar crime, embezzlement, things of that nature. Also, some small time conspiracies, things like that. So, it definitely is important. Some of the big ones you might be familiar with as far as RICO would be Hell's Angels cases, cases with Catholic priests in sex abuse cases, and some Major League Baseball issues. This is when RICO tends to get pulled up and kind of gets in the mainstream. So that's really what RICO is: racketeering, influenced, and corrupt or no, corrupt? Yeah, Corrupt Organization Act. How about that? I actually got it right the first time. All right. And then finally, the last thing when we talk about inchoate offenses, we need to talk about solicitation. And I'm sure if you like crime shows and things like that, you've heard the term solicitation before. And so, what does it mean? What is solicitation? And typically, solicitation is the precursor, the thing that happens before conspiracy. Because the whole thing with solicitation is you're instigating an agreement. It's possible that solicitation is before conspiracy because it's never officially formed and is never officially committed. So, solicitation is words. It is speaking words and attempting to commit some kind of crime. So, specifically, the way the model penal code kind of explains it is as a person is guilty of solicitation to commit a crime if, with the purpose of promoting or facilitating its commission, they commands, encourages, or requests another person to engage in specific conduct which would constitute such crime. So, this is why, if you're familiar with it, soliciting a prostitute is actively engaging in conversation with the prostitute to pay for their services. You didn't pay for the services, you didn't have the services, you used the words trying to initiate that. That's what solicitation is. It's words. And clearly, the intent has to be purposely or specific intent. And much like the last one, because you don't necessarily actually commit the crime, you can renunciate. You can say, yes, I may have done that, but I decided against it, and I'd like to work with you. So those are our main inchoate offenses. Just a quick reminder: attempt, conspiracy, and solicitation. But boy, are we not done yet, because now we're going to talk about homicide. And literally, the definition of homicide is the killing of one human being by another. And this gets complicated as you see fourth main bullet down: feticide, abortion, and what is a human being. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But we can actually thank our general understanding and definition of homicide from good old fashioned English common law, Sir William Blackstone. He defined homicide as falling under one of three categories: either justifiable, excusable, or felonious. Obviously, a justifiable homicide was not criminal because there was no guilt. Excusable were not crimes because they included minimal guilt. It was one of those, maybe the individual had a good reason, maybe they weren't in the right mind, but felonious homicide, those were criminal, and they were considered the most heinous offense because, well, you knew what you were doing and you actively chose to kill an individual. So that's how the breakdown went down. And so that is how we got to where we are now with murder versus manslaughter. And when we talk about murder, there's first degree, second degree, and third degree in some jurisdictions. We'll talk about that as well. But if it wasn't for William Blackstone and these breakdowns of justifiable homicide, excusable homicide, and felonious homicide, we probably wouldn't have the distinction of murder or manslaughter. And so if you're someone who has not ever really considered either of these terms, what does it mean? Murder means that there is an intent. There is a clear and specific intent to end an individual's life. Manslaughter is where the intent is not to end that person's life. It tends to be the result of typically some other crime or a mistake or some kind of issue where the intent of committing a crime is different than ending a person's life. So that's why I say intent matters when we talk about murder versus manslaughter. So what the heck is first degree murder, second degree murder, and third degree murder? Well, first degree murder is the, straightforward, worst. How do I want to say it? I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this exactly. So, first degree murder is the most serious degree. Grading, that's how I can do it. We've talked about it before. When we talk in legal terms, there's the idea of grading, where you rank different crimes at different levels. Truly, the grading for murder is first degree, second degree, third degree. So first degree is the obvious, that is the main level. That is the highest potential level for murder. When we get down to second degree and third degree, that's where things start to change a little bit. So typically with first degree murder, it is premeditated with specific means and is definitely graded as a felony. So like I said, most states have first and second, not all have third. If a state or jurisdiction allows the death penalty, first degree murder is the only crime that an individual can get the death penalty for. That's it. Second degree murder, we'll talk about that in a second. Because I just realized, in a case where first degree murder is charged and an individual is in a jurisdiction where the death penalty is not allowed, that is where they would get life in prison. Does that make I say does that make sense? Expecting an actual response. So I hope that's clear. Second degree murder is any murder that is not first degree murder. And I know that sounds really dumb, but it excludes murders that are premeditated or committed with a specific means. The idea here is that the murder was committed with the intent to inflict serious bodily injury, um, but not necessarily to, completely murder someone. And then third degree murder is, well, just once again, typically this usually gets lumped in with manslaughter because it's not always, the most well thought out. Essentially, to try and explain it without getting too complicated, um, first degree is very specific. Second degree is it's missing some of the components of the first one, and third degree is it's missing components of the second degree as well. So it's lesser pieces. It's a if you can't get them on first degree murder, you try for second or third degree because you can't necessarily prove all of it, so you go for the lesser. That's kind of what comes down to. So, with that being said, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to talk about feticide, abortion, and what is a human being. So, if you're looking and seeing feticide, well, what the heck does that? Feticide is the killing of an infant, or specifically in this case, it's a fetus because it's feticide, infanticide, infanticide. Infanticide is killing of an infant. Homicide is killing of a human being. I'm pretty much giving you a mini English lesson. ICIDE is the killing of. And pretty much if you take any of the other Latin words and put them in there, it means what you're talking about. So suicide is the self. Homicide is another human being. Matricide, killing a mother. Patricide, killing the father. Fratricide, killing your brother. Soricide, killing your sister. They're all specific pieces, but as far as legal definitions are concerned, we just used homicide because it's killing of another human being. But feticide is a weird one because it's the killing of a fetus. And so the question becomes, especially when we talk about, post Roe v. Wade and abortion laws, how do you classify this? And so, in case you can't figure out, feticide is mostly a Texas legal issue. It does appear in other states that are very particular about anti-abortion laws. They consider it feticide, which is, the killing of a fetus, but they classify that a fetus is a human being. And this is where the issue is because the definition of homicide is the killing of one human being by another. This is an ethical question. What is a human being? This is philosophy. This is high-end thinking, and the reason why, for the most part, people have said, and part of the reason why the excuse me, the Supreme Court decided to overturn Roe v. Wade and make abortion rights something that each state deals with, because by saying that you cannot deny it, it's saying that a fetus is not a full human being. Whether you agree with it or not, whether that's how you feel about it or not, this is what the issue is. Yes, the issue of overturning Roe v. Wade has a lot more deeper implications, specifically about female bodily autonomy and things of that nature. I'm 100% on board with that. There's a lot of issues that are interwoven into it. But this is part of the reason why the debate comes up of, should it be allowed? Should it be constitutional right. Because what is a human being? And unfortunately, we're not a philosophy class, so we're not going to be digging into this, but I urge you to consider this and think about this as we talk about that. So, again, it's just an important piece to note that there are specific jurisdictions in our country that have specific laws about feticide, and abortion is not, but it is, and so it's a gray area. And now, without Roe v. Wade protection, it gets into a whole nother mess. So, just wanted to bring it up as a relevant modern day issue and something that I think was a good example to talk about. Now, suicide, as I kind of mentioned, literally means killing oneself, but there are not laws that say you can't kill yourself. The laws that are out there are you can't assist someone with killing themselves, because the act of helping an individual kill themselves, you are in fact a human being killing another. So it's a weird gray area. If you have been around long enough, or you are familiar with the old school memes or jokes, you might know of Dr. Kevorkian. He was he was the first like mainstream doctor who was supportive of physician assisted suicide, and it's a very complicated matter. It's another one of those, is it morally okay? That is not our job to decide, even though if we're going into law, that's is our job. But it's a very complicated matter. So do know that suicide, there's not a law against committing suicide, but there are laws against assisting suicide, and that's where things get a little icky. And speaking of things getting a little icky and awkward, so I'm just going to preface this. Obviously, you're seeing this. If this is a topic that makes you uncomfortable, I urge you to just kind of do your best to not be part of this in particular. I'll be honest with you and straightforward. Reason that my original criminal justice thesis was on this particular topic, and a lot of the issues around it. So this is something that means a lot to me. It's an area of criminal justice and the law that I really want to see better. So I'm very familiar with a lot of this information. So I'm going to do my best to be as sensitive as possible in talking about this. Please know that if something that I'm talking about in this section bothers you, it is not my intention. I am not trying to trigger you or to re-victimize you if you were a victim of a sexual offense. If you were, do know that there are things available to you. There are services out there. But with that being said, so one of the things that we've really moved towards as a society in general is that we use the term sexual assault rather than the typical term, which is rape. And part of that actually has to do with its definitions, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. So, rape itself is rooted in Latin rapere, which literally meant to steal or seize. And one of the biggest issues of this as a legal topic is that the original definition of rape excluded marital rape and specified vaginal penetration by a penis. And if that alone makes you go, wait, you can already see the issue. The issue is that it was very particular, looking at only one piece and not identifying anything else. It was also use of force. So it gets really fuzzy and gray area. Nowadays, the definition is way broader and more encompassing. It's better phrased. It's not as gender specific as it used to be, especially since there's been more and more conversations that men can be raped as well. It's a whole thing, and so we've seen these changes. One of the important things is it wasn't until like 2008, 2009 that we finally changed uh, vaginal penetration by a penis to any kind of unwanted penetration. Like, it took us a long time to get to that. So, on the other end, and this is something that you might have heard before, sodomy. Sodomy was legally defined as the penetration of the male anus by a man. And if you go, wait a second, yeah, this is also a problematic definition, and this is a law that I don't know for sure if they're still in existence, but for the most part, it's accepted that they are unconstitutional laws uh, because the idea is that consenting adults can choose to do this. When they redefined sodomy to make it more gender neutral, it was the penetration of the anus by another individual. Well, here's an issue. What if they're consenting adults actually engaging in that? And so that, remember how I mentioned way earlier that, privacy of what people do in their own homes? This is why. These are the types of laws that get fuzzy. So, in general, like I said, both rape and sodomy have been redefined over time, years and years and years and years and years, and we're at a place where it's better defined, but that doesn't mean that we've fixed the problem. We fixed the definition, but we've not fixed the problem. So, the serious issue regarding this as a particular offense is the statistics show that rape prosecutions often result in acquittal, which means the defendant is being the one that is let go, the victim is not winning the case. And this has very far reaching implications. Um, and this is, like I said, part of the reason why I wanted to go into this particular part of the field and this particular part of the law, because this is a problem. And so, because the statistics show this, looking into it, a lot of it has to do with evidence, because the victim does not have to testify, and a lot of times the victim's testimony is the only evidence, and so all you have to do is prove that wrong. This is where the ever classic rape myths of, oh, she was asking for it, look what she was wearing, she was drunk, all those things lead to this problem. So, the quote unquote response from the criminal side is, well, clearly the victim needs to report the sexual assault promptly to proper authorities and submit to testing and interrogation to preserve any and all forms of relevant evidence. If you know anyone personally who has ever been either a victim of any crime or a victim of sexual assault, you will know that promptly is not going to happen usually. Sexual assault is a very violent act that it really severely hurts an individual on more than just the physical level. A lot of times there is a sense of guilt in victims. They feel that it might have been their fault, which is part of the way we frame it, and that's not okay. But telling to the proper authorities, there are three particular things to know about humans when we're in a dangerous situation. We have three responses. We have the fight response, where we fight back, the flight response, where we run away, but there's also a third one that's not often talked about, and that's freeze. We clam up inside ourselves and protect our mental state by freezing. And that's an issue when we look at, well, is that consent? Anyone that knows anything about consent knows it's not, but this is an issue. Well, you didn't fight back, so clearly you wanted it. That's not how that works. So sometimes promptly reporting to the proper authorities, if they don't believe that the proper authorities are going to listen to them, they're not going to report it. And even if they do, submitting to testing and interrogation. I'm going to talk about interrogation first. The fact that that's the term used should send up some big red flags. The second thing is, if you've ever been in a traumatic situation, you need time to collect your thoughts before you respond. Within police departments, there are rules that individuals who have been shot or in a very like life or death situation, they're supposed to have time before they're actually interviewed because they're not going to remember things quite clearly in the moment. Sometimes adrenaline, sometimes, there's a lot of different possibilities. There's a lot of psychology behind this. So saying you need to do this right away is not the most accurate way to go about this. But the last thing about this issue with this is the testing. Um, if you are an individual who's ever been told about, if you go to the hospital, you can get a rape kit done. This is a medical procedure that collects potential DNA samples from the assault. And it's done as respectfully as possible, but it is invasive, especially after being in that vulnerable situation. You are vulnerable yet again to a medical professional as they go over your entire body and gather evidence. And this means if you are a woman, there is going to be swabs and things that are being inserted into you to collect any potential DNA from your attacker. This is not oh, it's fine, I'll just get the test and I'll be fine. It is very intense. Sorry, I needed a second. This is just, like I said, this is a very serious issue and something I care deeply about. Um, I've had two partners that I was with for a very long time each. Both were direct victims of sexual abuse um, before I dated each one of them. And then one, while we were dating, she was home over the summer and was assaulted at her job. And so this is something that is near and dear to my heart. This is a serious thing. And so I try to keep my emotions out of it, but this is one of those type of offenses where I get caught up in it. So apologies if I seemed unfair or unreasonable or upset about this. It's important to me. The thing I can say that's positive about this is that we do have rape shield laws. And so, in particular, rape shield laws are any kind of statute that's in place to disallow information to be used against a victim's credibility. So, this is, you can't use, oh, that's what you were wearing. Oh, you were at the party. Oh, you were flirting with them. Rape shield laws prevent that from being used against you in a case. There are still things that can be used against you, but the rape shield law attempts to stop as much of that as possible. But again, it's not a all over the place thing. So there are other offenses using force, fear, or physical restraint. Before I go into that, there's a little bit more with sexual offenses, but it's more of just kind of general statements and it's less hard. It's things like statutory rape, where it's just having sex, whether it's consensual or not, with someone who's under the legal age of consent. That is complicated in itself because the age of consent is not consistent across the nation. In some states it's 16, in some states it's 17, in some states it's 18. It's complicated, but know that that is a thing. And the other one that just needs to be mentioned is incest. If you're not familiar with incest, incest is having a physical sexual relationship with someone who you are related to. Again, this is not one of those. There is a federal law. It is up to the states. This is where the classic jokes of the South, uh, you know, their cousins are doing each other and things like that. Those jokes are all about incest. That's what that is. In some places, it is illegal. In other places, it is not. And in some places, it's illegal if they are less than your third cousin. Like, there are weird stipulations on that. Um, if you're interested more in that, I urge you to look into the world of state laws on particular things. Something that's not mentioned in our book but is related to this as well, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, because we are talking about criminal sexual offenses. Bestiality is something that also falls under here. That is sex with an animal. It is not outright illegal in all 50 states. Some states it's not illegal. Some states it's not illegal to own pornography of it. It gets really weird. Again, if you're interested in weird state laws that should be federal across the board, really incest and bestiality and age of consent are all three weird ones that when you start to look into it, you're like, why is that one? But yeah, if you're interested in weird law stuff, that's for you. So now going into the other side of this area of offenses. And so we're talking about offenses that use force, fear, or some kind of physical restraint. And so I put in particular assault and battery in here because this is the one that people tend to hear a lot. Sometimes we hear assault and battery as one word, not assaulted battery, assault and battery. Some places just have it as assault. Some places have both separate. The issue here is because how it's portrayed in media and the fact that they are different depending on where you are has led to a lot of confusion over what is assault and what is battery. And so, battery is unlawful touching. Typically has a harmful or offensive nature behind it. Assault is broken down typically into attempted battery, which is an act that attempts to make physical contact but falls short for some reason, or threatened battery assault, where your conduct causes the victim apprehension of immediate harmful or offensive physical contact. Assault can be words if there's hand gestures or a weapon or something of that nature. Assault is attempting to beat someone up. Battery is you beat someone up. But again, because in some jurisdictions assault and battery are one offense together, the concept of assault is that there was a plan to, and battery is you went forward and did it. So obviously in places where they're one law, they're kind of a combined piece, and I believe PA is one of those where it's assault and battery, but I believe it's just under assault as the term. In some places where they're separate, this is how you would break it down. So you could be charged for assault but not battery and that kind of thing. So I know it probably doesn't clear up any confusion over what's the difference between assault and battery, but just know that in some jurisdictions, assault is literally just combining assault and battery, but in others, it's not. That's the best I can tell you. Not that it's a laughing matter, but it's just kind of one of those really. So domestic violence is another thing that falls under, in particular, this area. Domestic violence is any criminal conduct that occurs between, I put quote family members and I put household. Domestic violence, the idea is that it is some kind of criminal conduct that's occurring between individuals who have a close, almost legal bond, a reason to be together, or a reason that if there was a reason to act law that they would have to act, they had a duty. Domestic violence, typically is seen between parents or exes and things of that nature. But it can be, just housemates. But the idea is that there's some kind of criminal conduct that occurs between family members within a particular household. Part of the issue with domestic violence is that uh, officers, how do I want to say this? Most places will require their officers who respond to domestic violence to have particular training because domestic violence is another one of those hazy statistic offenses. It is difficult to prove and it's difficult to break the cycle of domestic violence. If you know anything about the psychology of victims of domestic violence, there's a lot behind there. Um, but typically, any statutes in that have something specific on domestic violence look for special training for law enforcement for these things, protections for victims by no contact orders, and non disclosures of victims' resident address if they have to move for protection's sake. Duty of law enforcement or prosecutors to inform the victim of the decision of whether to prosecute, and the duty to inform the victim of any special procedures available to protect domestic violence victims. The ability to arrest domestic violence offenders with or without a warrant. That's an important piece. Special factors to consider in the sentencing of domestic violent offenders, and peace officer immunity for enforcement of domestic violence provisions. Domestic violence is one of the worst he said, she said issues. Um, Truly, if you think about the novel and movie from a few years back, Gone Girl, um, it's very much a domestic violence situation, mystery horror novel type story. Um, was the main character abusive? The male? Probably. But was the female just as abusive in how that handled? Yes. And so domestic violence is a very gray area type of crime, and it's hard to prove. So I just want to mention that it's one of those complicated ones. So now we get into some of the other uncomfortable ones like stalking. So before 1990, there was actually no specific statutes or laws that prevented stalking. Before that point, the only legal protection that anyone could get from stalking was a restraining order, which is why that's the popular thing that if you know about it, you're like, oh yeah, I've heard restraining order. Before 1990, that was the only way you could get protection. Nowadays, there are actual statutes and laws in place in different areas. So, like California does, California was the first one to do a stalking law, and that's actually because I'm forgetting the name. Rebecca Schaefer. She was an actress, and she was murdered. I can't lighten it up in any way. She was stalked by this guy for 2 years, and he killed her. And she tried getting a restraining order, and she tried, getting something against him for years, and they're like, no, you can't do anything, just restraining order. But a legal document that says you have to stay away from someone isn't going to stop someone that plans on it anyway. So now, of course, it's now an actual law in a lot of places. So if you are charged with stalking, you can be imprisoned and things of that nature. And stalking comes down to a very basic definition of any course of conduct that credibly threatens the victim's safety. So even if it's implied threatening, that could be considered stalking. So kidnapping, on the other hand, is a little bit more than stalking. Kidnapping is taking an individual. So specifically for kidnapping, it is a twofold definition of a crime. The first part is the defendant must confine the victim. This means that they have to bind them, place them somewhere where they cannot leave. They don't necessarily have to be physically bound and tied, but they are limited in how they can move and where they move. That's what confinement is. The second part of this is the defendant must move the victim. And this is a little bit complicated. Not every jurisdiction requires movement of the victim. Not every jurisdiction has the same understanding of how far the movement has to be. Technically, you could move the victim 5 feet, and in some jurisdictions that would count. In some, it has to be, significant. Kidnapping really is just keeping an individual, a victim, away from where they normally would be for an extended period of time. That's kidnapping. False imprisonment, or felonious restraint, because I love the extra older English terms that we use. They're not old English, they're just older words we don't quite use anymore, like felonious restraint. False imprisonment is lesser than kidnapping because it's lacking some element. So whether it's a particular part of intent, whether that is, they're not moving the victim, they're just confining them, or that's false imprisonment. So now we're going to talk about a different type of crime. We're going to talk about property offenses because, like I said, we have a lot to cover, and so we're just going to keep going. Property offenses are anything that affects, property. And property is one of those, what is property? And that's a big ethical question. But so we break it down into larger sections. And so the big blue chunks are the larger section, and then the lower parts are more things. So there is nonviolent theft, which is also now called consolidated theft statutes. These cover things like larceny, embezzlement, and false pretenses. If you are not quite sure what those terms actually mean, I hope that some of them you might be able to figure out just by looking at them. But so embezzlement, we've talked about it before when we talked about crimes that are committed thanks to, a job. This is where you are taking some kind of property from a place of work or a place that you have a connection to without admitting to it or falsifying those documents. Larceny is just theft of real property, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. And then false pretenses is that you are gaining the property through some kind of illegitimate means or a lie. And so really all of these things, and theft is the stealing of real property, personal property, or services. And so false pretenses has a lot of the services stuff, but you can include it in other places. So the physical taking is larceny. That is, you physically took something. There's no questions asked about that one. There is an issue within larceny, embezzlement, and false pretenses, and that's converting. And that is where you transfer possession of property to another individual. So false pretenses, if you remember I said services, it also is this. When you convert possession of property, you're like, well, it's not mine, it's yours now. You are transferring, you are converting the property to someone else, and that might be under false pretenses. That might be part of embezzlement. So these terms, it's important to understand what they mean and how they work together. So let's talk about federal mail fraud. Federal mail fraud really is trying to run a scam. It is theft by use of the Federal Postal Service. That is the legal definition of federal mail fraud. And typically, this is seen, uh, traditionally, was, you get a letter and it says, hey, we need the money for this, and you send it. And so that's how it started. Nowadays, if you watch YouTube or anything like that and you've heard of Kitboga, it's, dealing with scammers who call you all the time. Uh, it's all that kind of stuff falls under this original federal mail fraud. Um, Ponzi schemes are put under here as well because the idea behind any of this is that there is an individual who is several stages removed that is committing a crime and stealing property. They're committing theft from an individual through mail fraud. So that's really where this kind of comes in. And so this is actually the this is the start of things like bank fraud, healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, securities fraud, like I said, Ponzi schemes. All of these things come from this original federal mail fraud because that was the way you communicated with lots of people, was using the federal mail service. Nowadays we have 8 billion other ways, so now it's kind of evolved, but a lot of the early legal points are still used when we define theft through these other manners. So hopefully that explains that a little bit. So another term you might have heard is extortion, especially if you like crime shows. Extortion is just theft of property accomplished by threat to cause future harm. So please note, theft of property accomplished by threat to cause future harm. Extortion means that you didn't actually do any harm to the individual at that moment. You accomplished your theft by threatening to cause future harm. You may have caused harm in the moment, but you got it because you said there will be more in the future. Robbery is taking personal property by force or threat of force. So you could get charged with robbery and extortion, or you can just be charged with extortion or just robbery. But this is why those two are together, so we can talk about it. Extortion is threatening future harm to get what you want. Robbery is threatening force or using force and getting it in that moment. So, because of that, there are other property offenses that we need to talk about, and that's receiving stolen property, and this one's a weird one. So, receiving stolen property is defined as receiving, retaining, disposing of, selling, trafficking in, buying, or aiding in concealment of stolen personal property. And the other caveat of this is that it does not require physical possession, just control over the item. So, like the quote unquote ownership of the item. So, the reason why this is a weird one is because pawn shops and brokers and things like that, and the issue of consignment shops and pawn shops where you can sell your items or temporary house them for money and things like that. Do the individual know that it's stolen property? Not always. It's a gray area, but they should be able to know if it's stolen or not, and it gets into a bigger mess, and that's why I said this is a complicated one. Typically, people that work as fences where they sell stolen property, like their job is to find buyers and things of that nature, and some pawn shops definitely actively know that they're receiving stolen property. This is the legal ramifications. You can be criminally charged for receiving stolen property. You can make a defense if you bought stolen property, if you did not know reasonably that business bought stolen property and sold stolen property, and you've actually bought it and you did not know, you could make that case. But it's important to note that this is a problem, and it does not require you to physically own it, just control the item technically. Burglary, on the other hand, is the illegal entering into an area. Notice I stopped there, but it seemed like there's more. Because, welcome to another example of, because we have 50 different states, we have so many different possibilities for definition. Burglary at its basic level is illegal entering into an area, period. The problem is several jurisdictions have different qualifiers. And so, in the most restrictive areas, burglary is illegal entering into an area through some physical force and remaining in the area. In some areas, in some jurisdictions, it's illegal entering into an area through some sort of physical force, breaking and entering kind of thing. So it depends on your jurisdiction what is defined as burglary, but it's important to note that the basic point is entering an area that you are not supposed to be in. You're doing it illegally, which of course then goes into criminal trespassing, and this is unauthorized entry or remaining in a place that is owned by another individual with general intent or knowingly that the entry or staying there was unauthorized. So criminal trespass is you went into somewhere or you stayed somewhere where you know you're not supposed to be, but you're doing it anyway. So obviously there is that intent, and that's important. Intent matters when we talk about criminal statutes. Notice, I haven't been talking about it nearly as much because most of them require some kind of general intent or knowingly for almost all of these. So let's finish out property offenses by talking about arson and criminal mischief. So arson generally is the setting of fire to or burning of real or personal property. Pretty straightforward. I've mentioned it several times before. Arson is lighting a particular place on fire. Some jurisdictions will have arson as a misdemeanor rather than a felony. There is felony arson, or felony arson, not felony arsony, felony arson. But that comes down to grading issues and amount of damage, and if there was casualties and things of that nature, that would also play a part in the overall definition and grading of arson. But I want to note, model penal code is slightly different. Starting a fire or causing an explosion. This is where things get interesting. So several jurisdictions just have the setting of fire to or burning of real or personal property as the definition of arson, but model penal code includes this causing an explosion. And I just wanted to at least bring attention to it because the idea is that an explosion potentially could also start a fire, but an explosion could be the result of a fire, an uncontained fire. Like, the idea was that just saying fire was not enough, because if someone caused an explosion that led to a fire, did they start the fire? No, the explosion started the fire. Well, so then the explosion caused it. So rather than, fight over definitions and semantics, you just make it include an explosion. So there's that. Criminal mischief is damaging, destroying, interfering with, or tampering with property that's not yours. Plain and simple. This is the one that people are familiar with typically because, teenagers at Halloween time, being who they are. Damaging property. All right. So now we're into the last two chapters of the book, which are offenses against the public and then offenses versus the government. And so we're going to start with offenses against the public, and just going to dive right into it. So there is a category of quality of life crimes. And really what this comes down to is that these are crimes that, quote, do damage to the quality of life of individuals within that particular jurisdiction. So these are the types of laws that, you probably are familiar with just simply because they're the ones that people hear all the time. Disorderly conduct, also known as disturbing the peace. this is the ever classic, noise complaints and things of that nature. The defendant must make a loud and unreasonable noise, obscene utterance or gesture, engage in fighting or threatening, or state fighting words, or create a hazardous condition by an act that does not serve a legitimate purpose. This is, you are just causing a problem, which is not the same as causing a riot. That will come up in a minute. So disorderly conduct, most people are very familiar with that one. So vagrancy, if you're familiar with it, you are probably familiar with what it's known for now versus what it was intended for. And so we're going to talk about what it was intended for. Vagrancy was broadly drafted when it came out and when it first started being a law, so that law enforcement had discretion, so that they could arrest the unemployed, they could arrest illegal gamblers, they could arrest drug addicts, alcoholics, and individuals who frequented prostitution and other locations of, quote, ill repute. Vagrancy was meant to stop crimes from being committed before they happened. Nowadays, vagrancy is used more often than not to illegally detain homeless individuals. And there are debates over the constitutionality of that. Can you legally arrest an individual who does not have a permanent residence, that can't afford a residence? It's a weird area. So like I said, vagrancy literally just means that you are wandering about, that you don't have, well, not wandering because that's loitering. Vagrancy is that you don't have a place to be. You're just kind of there. And so nowadays it's mostly associated with panhandlers and the homeless, and still drug addicts and alcoholics. Loitering, on the other hand, is wandering, remaining with the specific intent or purpose to gamble, beg, or engage in prostitution. Loitering is not just, standing outside of a building, it's standing outside of a building with intent to do something. The legal reason is it's to do something illegal. If you're just loitering outside of a business, what are you there to do? Are you there to disturb the peace? Like, this is how it gets defined nowadays. So loitering is this just kind of wandering and staying within an area where you aren't supposed to be and planning to commit some other crime. Unfortunately, related to vagrancy and homelessness, we have sit-lie laws, and these are not everywhere. These are in some particular jurisdictions, but the idea is that you cannot legally sit or lay down in public spaces, in doorways, and things like that. And for the most part, all of those laws were designed to attack the homeless. And if you're familiar with the problem of homelessness in general, it's a complicated matter. And so the reason why sit-lie laws depend on jurisdiction is because it is a constitutional question. Can you force someone who doesn't have a place to live to keep moving? So it's a gray area. It's another thing that I would like to see changed, but I don't see it happening in my lifetime. So we also have crimes that target group conduct, and we'll talk about criminal gangs in a minute. But so crimes that target group conduct are like unlawful assembly and failure to disperse. Unlawful assembly is grouping up together with people with the specific intent to commit a breach of the peace, some other lawful act, or to riot. Unlawful assembly is getting together with the specific intent to breach the peace or commit some kind of unlawful act or riot. So peaceful protests are not unlawful assemblies. If you gather together to cause a riot or to disturb the peace, then yes, you are unlawfully assembling. Failure to disperse is when an officer or public servant orders a group that's participating in disorderly conduct that is likely to cause some substantial harm, serious annoyance, or alarm. If they are warned to disperse and they do not, that would be failure to disperse, and that would be a criminal charge. Please note, if the officer orders a group to disperse where they are participating in disorderly conduct that is likely to cause substantial harm, serious annoyance, or alarm. This means that just because an officer doesn't agree with it doesn't mean that it is covered under failure to disperse. It has to have this extra part of it. And then riot is something that deserves to be talked about separately, but still part of this. A riot is just a group commission of an unlawful act of violence or a lawful act in a violent manner, in tumultuous manner, rather. A violent and tumultuous, which means violent and wild, unfocused. So, what are criminal gangs? The best way I can say this is criminal gangs are complicated to define. Yeah. Criminal gangs are difficult because depending on how serious, how large, how small, particular crime, interest, things of that nature, things change. Typically, criminal gangs, there's actively participating members in a criminal gang, and they promote, further, or assist in any felony with the general intent or knowingly that members of the gang engage in a pattern of criminal gang activity. That's how you can get in trouble for being part of a criminal gang. It's the same thing with kind of like conspiracy. You are connected to the other individuals. Some gangs use imagery and tattoos, some have slang and words, and just know that criminal gangs are organized crime groups. There is a hierarchy with clear distinctions of who does what, and that they commit some kind of illegal activity. That's what it means to be part of a criminal gang. And of course, the last area of offenses against the public are vice crimes. And they're vice crimes because they offend sensibilities and they are often victimless and harmless. And so, yeah, these are ones where you go, why is this illegal for sometimes? So drug crimes, manufacturing, cultivating, possession, selling, and using specific drugs are all part of a vice. Is it a victimless crime to manufacture and sell drugs? Depends on your opinion of that. I have to bring this one up because I can't help it. Prostitution is illegal in every state except for Nevada. So everywhere else, offering, agreeing, or engaging in sexual conduct for money, property, or anything of value is considered prostitution. I would ask you, is it harmless and victimless? I would say it is, typically. Having consensual sex with another individual does not seem to be a crime that hurts someone. But I digress. Gambling, this is a weird one. So, not every state has legal gambling. I'm going to start with that. States that have casinos have legal gambling and illegal gambling. So they typically have specific rules and laws in place in those states for what constitutes as legal gambling and what isn't legal gambling. So what's illegal. PA is a state that does have legal gambling and illegal gambling. And once again, if you go to that wonderful website, which I'm sure if it's not up there, I'll have it up there now, of PA statutes and laws and criminal offenses, we have a whole subsection on illegal gambling. So it's important to note, yes, PA does have legal gambling, so you can go to the casino and you're not going to get in trouble for breaking the law by quote unquote gambling. But illegal gambling is something, and like I said, it varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For the most part, if a location does not have a particular license to offer games of chance and things of that nature, unless you have a temporary one, which you can apply for. If you don't have a temporary or you don't have a permanent gaming license, you are illegally gambling in the state of PA. Anyway, public drunkenness, this is another one of those. It depends on where you are. Some places it's just a misdemeanor. Sometimes it's just a code infraction. Public drunkenness and driving while under the influence, these all fall under vice crimes because they offend the sensibilities of someone or some group within society as a whole. All right. Excuse me. Now we get into offenses against the government, and I have perhaps one of my favorite little clips. I don't have the clip, but it's just a screenshot from Arrested Development. One of my favorite lines. There's a good chance that I may have committed some light treason. So we're going to talk about treason. We're going to talk about sedition, sabotage, espionage. We're going to talk about all these kinds of bigger issues of governmental crimes, or rather crimes against the government. So we're going to talk about crimes against national security. So treason is defined as the levying war against the United States or adhering to the enemy by giving aid and or comfort. The reason why this joke is light treason, spoiler alert if you ever intend on watching Arrested Development and you don't know what this is about. 3, 2, 1. I'm spoiling it now. The bald individual, George Bluth, had built homes over in Iraq that Saddam Hussein was using during the war on terror in a post 9/11 world. So he was giving aid or comfort to the enemy. So that might have committed some light treason. That should explain things up. Sedition, rather than treason, sedition is advocating, aiding, teaching, organizing, or printing, publishing, or circulating written material that advocates, aids, or teaches the overthrow of the U.S. government or any state, district, or territory thereof by force or violence. I made a grammar mistake. It's teaches, not teachers. But the idea is that sedition is that you are actively attempting to teach or provide assistance to individuals who want to overthrow the government, whether it be the federal government, the state government, district, whatever it may be, through violence or force. Sabotage is destroying, damaging, or defectively producing property with a specific intent to impede the nation's ability to prepare for or participate in war and national defense. So sabotage is stopping something. It's doing some kind of work to prevent successful either participation or preparation. Espionage gets its own slide, and if you are familiar with the Hitman series, I had to include the explosive rubber duck with espionage on it because espionage is spy work, plain and simple. So if you like spy shows and spy stories and things like that, espionage is that kind of spy-esque work. But obviously there's a difference between fantasy and reality. So we're going to talk about the reality of espionage. And so one thing that's important is espionage changes depending on when it occurs. So if it occurs during a time of peace or during a war, there are different conditions that are required for it to be considered a crime. So during a time of peace, espionage is where you gather, transmit, or attempt to gather or transmit defense information with the general intent that it will be used to damage the United States or assist any foreign nation. Period. So during times of peace, it's the idea that you are feeding information or trying to feed information to an enemy or foreign nation in an attempt to hurt the United States. During times of war, it is the collecting, recording, publishing, or communicating information about military activities or to attempt any of the foregoing with the intent that the information will be transmitted to the enemy. So, this is where a serious conversation and issue comes up when we consider this. Again, this goes back quite a few years, and if you've not ever really cared about politics or world politics, world history, things like that, you might not remember, but the Edward Snowden case of espionage and the entire WikiLeaks creation. This is why he was charged with criminal espionage and fled the country, is during a quote-unquote time of war. We were still at war with particularly Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. During a time of war, collecting, recording, publishing information about military activities, was making it available. Like, that classifies as espionage. That is a criminal offense. So that's a real world example. Hopefully that helps make sense to you. But let's talk about some other pieces with offenses against the government. And so we can get into terrorism. Terrorism is the scary buzzword that has been going around for quite a while in the United States. A lot of people say, oh, it's been around since 9/11. Technically, it was around before that. We're looking at like the 70s, 80s is really where it's was highly used. But yes, definitely in a post 9/11 world, terrorism is a term that most people understand and know. But it's important to note what is defined as an act of terrorism. And so it's broken up into international terrorism and domestic terrorism. And if you're reading ahead, you'll see that domestic terrorism is literally the same thing, but just with one change. We'll talk about why I have issues with this and why we need to have a better conversation of this with the general public. So, international terrorism is defined as violent acts committed outside the U.S. that would be criminal if committed in the U.S. and appear to be intended to influence civilian population or government by intimidation or to affect the conduct of government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. Plain and simple. That's pretty straightforward. Domestic terrorism is everything that's above except that it's within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. So, domestic terrorism is violent acts committed within U.S. territorial jurisdiction that is intended to influence civilian population or government by intimidation or to affect the conduct of government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. The January 6th insurrection was an act of domestic terrorism. We, for a very long time in this country, have been very cautious to use the word domestic terrorism, especially since 9/11. There were times where we called school shooters, well, we didn't really have school shooters in an earlier point, but we would call them domestic terrorists because they were committing crimes that were clearly designed to do something. Now we've chosen different words. We need to continue talking domestic terrorism because when we say terrorist, there's an idea that it's international. It's a hard time to believe that there can be a domestic terrorist. And so we need to remind ourselves that this is something that's real and an issue. And so because of terrorism, we need to talk about the USA Patriot Act. If you're not familiar with the Patriot Act, it's simply called the Patriot Act for most people because it's the easier understanding. But the full name is USA Patriot Act because it's an acronym. It stands for the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. Founded in 2001, shortly after September 11th. What did the Patriot Act do? It basically allowed the government to have a wide reach and, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the word, discretion. It gave the U.S. government discretion to tap phones, emails, whatever, all with the idea to intercept and obstruct terrorism. The Patriot Act gave the U.S. government the right to legally spy on its citizens to intercept and obstruct terroristic acts. That was the whole point. If you note, I have in brackets First and Fourth Amendment issue. The First Amendment is the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom to gather. If the government can access the things you say, do you have freedom to say what you want to say? Fourth Amendment is your right to privacy. Do you have privacy if they can tap your conversations and things like that? Like, all of a sudden, we are now, because we are so far removed from the original event of September 11th, 2001, we're having deeper conversations about this. And a lot of people forget that it was enacted and is legal because of the USA Patriot Act. Because the idea was that we were intercepting and obstructing terrorism. And it's why we need to continue to talk about domestic terrorism, because that's how it's allowed to be used on our own citizens. It's domestic terrorism. But when we don't use that term, we see it as something else. We need to have clear lines. But yeah, that's just important to note that the Patriot Act is what allows governmental access to your private information, and why it is or is not a First and Fourth Amendment issue. Another thing, this is just directly related to terrorism in particular. The Department of Homeland Security was officially founded in 2002. They did not exist before September 11th, 2001. They existed as of 2002, and it was designed in particular for terroristic issues. All right, so going back to some broader parts of offenses against the government, we have three areas here. We have perjury, bribery, and obstruction of justice. So perjury, if you've heard it before because you like crime dramas or courtroom dramas, perjury is lying under oath. That's the basic, like, super short definition that people understand. The larger definition is a false material statement that the defendant does not believe to be true, made under oath in any official proceeding. Please note that the defendant does not believe to be true. It's not lying under oath. It is, but it isn't. It is knowing that what you're saying is not true. If you truly believe that what you're saying is not a lie, it's not perjury. If you know what you said is a lie and it's found out, that is perjury. So that's why I say it's false material statement. So it is lying under oath, but it's specifically a lie that you do not believe in. Like, you actively know you're lying. That's perjury. Bribery should be pretty obvious, but the act of conferring, offering, agreeing to confer, soliciting, accepting, or agreeing to accept any monetary benefit in exchange for a public servant, party official, voter's decision, opinion, recommendation, vote, or other exercise of discretion. Plain and simple, you're paying someone some kind of good or service for their power, their opinion, their vote, whatever it may be. Obstruction of justice, this is the one that people tend to know as, oh, what is obstruction of justice? I've heard it. This is giving false identification to law enforcement, impersonating law enforcement, refusing to aid law enforcement when requested, giving false evidence, hiding or concealing an individual, or whether it's yourself or another person, refusing to give evidence, tampering with evidence, and tampering with a witness. Pretty much the idea of obstruction of justice is if your activity and goal is to prevent law enforcement from doing their job, that is obstruction of justice. And then to wrap it all up, our last three pieces of offenses that are against the government, we have contempt, we have a resisting arrest, and we have escape. I'm going to go in reverse order. So escape is just escaping from legal custody of law enforcement. The idea is that an individual, if you are, in transport from a police station to an actual prison and you escape that legal custody that you are under, you are committing escape. Resisting arrest, in the same way, you are intentionally preventing or attempting to prevent a police officer or peace officer from effecting an authorized arrest of the individual or another person. And contempt is disobedience of an order of a court, conduct tending to obstruct or interfere with the orderly administration of justice. Typically, contempt is used in court. So contempt of court is, you are disobeying the guidelines and rules that are set forward in the court. But this actually goes outside of the court as well. If an order of the court is that you must show up at a certain time at a certain location and you do not, that is contempt of court. That is a federal crime. Or not a federal crime, that is a criminal offense. If a court says that you have to complete 25 hours of community service by a certain date and you complete 24 hours and do not finish the last hour, you are in contempt. If you decide to just completely bail and not show up for your court case, you are in contempt. All of these things, this is any kind of disobeying the order of a court. And so any conduct that obstructs or interferes with orderly administration of justice is considered contempt. And that's it. Thank you very much for sticking it out with me. I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.